Hello, my name is Joseph Kenrick. I recently gave this presentation at the Space Resources Roundtable conference held at the Colorado School of Mines. And I've had several requests to record it so that it can be shared and the conversation that I'm going to be talking about can be continued. I'm very happy to see the positive reaction it's received and the seeming consensus of its importance. So this presentation today is about narratives surrounding space. My goal of this presentation is to instill a sense of urgency in you about the potential state of the space and therefore space resources industry. The hope is that this will then stimulate future conversations around space, policy, and public narratives. I'm going to provide an example in the oil and gas industry to illustrate my concern of what can happen to the space industry. Then I'm going to provide you with some information to take back to your companies and communities to, again, begin that conversation. So a little about me, just to illustrate my background in seeing this issue we're going to be talking about today. So I actually got my bachelor's degree in petroleum engineering with a minor in economics from Mines back in 2017. Several years after that, I worked as an engineer in the oil and gas industry, primarily in California, but I also have experience in Texas, New Mexico, and Thailand. At the beginning of last year, I started my master's degree in the Space Resources program, again at Mines, and I've done some research in the program. And earlier this year, I started as a Space Resources engineer for Lunar Outpost. So I'm going to start with an analog situation that's a few years to decades ahead of the space industry in this regard, and that's the oil and gas industry in California. So here are a few headlines illustrating some common public narratives surrounding the industry. There's concerns around hydraulic fracturing or fracking, pollution, health, and safety. I'm sure many of you have seen some of these headlines or even that movie, Gasland. So I'm not here to sway you on the oil and gas industry. I'm just trying to illustrate what can happen when misinformation and negative narratives are left unchecked. There's a tipping point in terms of narratives swaying the general public. Oil and gas in California is past that tipping point, but I don't believe the space industry is yet, which is why this is pertinent now. As I will demonstrate, fighting, or rather correcting these narratives with facts and information after the fact has little effect. We as humans strongly attach emotions with memories, so when you have an uninformed and neutral public that we call the movable middle, they can be rather easily swayed to the negative with an emotional response, such as one of these headlines. Getting them to then sway back to neutral, let alone positive, can be extremely difficult. Therefore, informing them now and ideally attaching the information with an emotional response is key to winning the narrative fight before it's too late. The oil and gas industry didn't act when these narratives were gaining steam, as some of the information they didn't think was that big of a deal, and for others, like fracture fluid, which I'll talk about more in a minute, was proprietary information, so to be fair, they didn't want to share it. This silence, however, enabled a void that was filled in by their opposition. The space industry hangs in a similar balance if we don't start speaking up, and we'll see a similar downfall in public opinion. So why does that matter? Well, let me show you the effect that these headlines had in the industry over the past couple of years. Over the past couple of years in California, there's been a ban on all new cyclic steam wells, a primary well production type for production of oil and gas. There's been a ban on hydraulic fracturing, the primary well stimulation technique for the production of oil and gas. The industry faces the most stringent regulations in the world. You can see a list of some of the laws and agencies that govern the industry on the right. The industry faces the highest tax rates, and there's immense pressure on government officials to uphold these bans, create more bans, more regulations, and overall increase the cost to operate. So the oil and gas industry is just now fighting back with some of this information I'm going to share now, but again, it's an uphill battle versus the position we are in where we can stay ahead of the curve. So I'm sure many of you have heard of hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And the general sentiment around fracking is that it contaminates groundwater, it's filled with hazardous material, and uses exorbitant amounts of water that could be better used for other things. So hydraulic fracturing is a production well stimulation technique that creates a split in the rock the width of a human hair deep below the surface and creates a path for oil to flow out from the reservoir into the well. Otherwise, it has to flow through rocks, so in many cases, it can be a necessary stimulation technique. There are multiple layers of steel pipes surrounded by cement between any fracture fluid and any potential groundwater. And to date, in California, there have been no documented instances of groundwater contamination due to hydraulic fracturing. Fracking is achieved by pumping 99.5% water and sand. Sand is used to keep that fracture open, along with 0.5% of other household items in the form of additives, such as table salt and guar gum, which is an adhesive found in toothpaste and ice cream, helps suspend that sand in the water. Per year, hydraulic fracturing uses 0.003% of the total allocated water consumption for California. The typical golf course uses more water per day. So again, I'm not here to try and sell you on the oil and gas industry, just illustrating that some of those headlines may not be completely truthful. And understandably, the public doesn't fully understand these rather technical topics, so they're rather easily swayed to the negative. For the parents or professors listening, I can imagine it's extremely difficult to teach a student or a child when they don't want to learn the information you're trying to give them. The same situation the industry is in now. So one more example, one more narrative example in terms of the oil and gas industry, and that's the pollution that the in-state production of oil and gas causes. So the answer, according to mainstream narratives, is to stop the in-state production of oil and gas. Now, obviously, there is pollution associated with oil and gas. It's important to address that. It does make the conversation a little more difficult, and I'll talk about that in regards to the space industry a little more later. The production of oil and gas is actually rather clean. It's the consumption that causes the pollution. Perhaps splitting hairs here, but it's a key difference in terms of supply and demand that I'll illustrate now. So again, regardless of your political stance or views, I'm just going to share some facts. All of those effects that I just showed, the banning on fracking, the banning on cyclic steam, the overall increase in cost to operate, has drastically decreased the production in the states with the cleanest and safest production in the world. But because demand is not going down, all of that lost production is now being imported from foreign countries with little to zero regulations. And to add to those concerns, all of that oil and gas is being imported or being brought over via tankers, which are found to be some of the worst polluting machines in the world. For instance, my head's kind of blocking it here, but 15 of the largest tankers in the world now pollute as much sulfur oxide products as 760 million cars. In Long Beach, the port of Los Angeles broke its own record 2 years ago for having 80 of these tankers in queue waiting to come dock into Los Angeles. So this situation is what I like to call lose-lose. Pollution is worse off, so it's a lose for the environment. It's a loss for Californians who now pay more in gas prices than any other state in the lower 48, and it's a lose for the industry. So do you think if Californians had this information prior to these narratives gaining steam, things would be different? Maybe, maybe not. But the point I'll illustrate here now with space is that this is too important to me, at least, to stand by and find out. So let's take a look at some of the narratives surrounding the space industry. I'm sure we've all heard the billionaire space race narrative by now. There's a lot of concerns around space tourism, the spending of these billionaires in NASA, the pollution these rockets cause, as well as the elitism associated with it all. So let's address some of these concerns, starting with spending and NASA's budget in particular. There was a large-scale survey conducted over several decades that culminated in 2007 that asked the general public what they believed NASA's budget was as a percentage of the federal budget. For several decades, the public thought NASA's budget was 24% of the federal budget, a near 50-fold increase in the actual 0.5% budget. A similar survey was conducted in 2018. That number has since dropped to 7%, still a 14-fold increase in the actual 0.5%. And in the survey, they also asked the public what they believe NASA's budget should be in comparison to what they thought it was. So when you took the public's new proposed budget, even if it was a budget cut in their eyes, and compared it to the 0.5% budget, 85% of people would have actually given NASA more money. So the concern for spending is not about spending, it's about the perception of spending. Until public outreach and communication channels are established, this incorrect perception of things will be what ultimately influences the policies and therefore the budgets. To compare the budgets real quick, the federal and state taxes on tobacco in 2021 was 160% that of NASA's budget. And the federal taxes on cigarettes alone fund the human spaceflight program at NASA. Now, for analytical type people, it may be enough to just show these numbers and charts, but again, for the movable middle, attaching them with an emotional response is key. The general sentiment around spending is that it should be spent on problems here on Earth, such as social programs. For every $1 we spend on NASA, we spend $227 on social programs, but the public still pushes to move that $1 over. Social programs have a much stronger emotional reaction than space does. It's targeting helping hungry kids, those with disabilities, veterans. So they draw to people's emotional well more, and people naturally think, why are we giving such exorbitant amounts of money to space? Now, I'm certainly not saying that these social programs do not deserve that $227. I think the important takeaway here for counteracting these narratives is to illustrate what we get out of that relative $1. Every year, NASA puts off a spin-off technology presentation that illustrates what we get out of that $1. They also have an interactive website that shows items around your home and city that were a result of NASA spending. So I'm not going to dive into these technologies here. I encourage everyone to do that on their own, because everyone will connect with each technology differently. I do have the links to the resources at the end, and I'll provide one example at the end. So the last narrative we'll look at today is, again, pollution in terms of the space industry now. So the public only knows what they're seeing in media. So they may think that space tourism is the end goal, which is currently seen in a negative light. What we need to do in order to fill the void of public sentiment before the opposing narratives fill it for us is complete the picture. And that's to tie it back to space resources and how that will eventually bring value back to Earth. I know, for example, Blue Origin has the mission statement to have 1 million people living and working in space. That's something I'm all for. But all the public sees are rich people going up in rockets. Now, I and perhaps many of you can see how we get from A to Z in that regard, but the general public cannot. If one of the long-term goals is to decrease pollution and ward off the most devastating effects of climate change, then there's going to be short-term cost that's incurred, and that might paradoxically be more environmental degradation. To put some numbers to it, the United States electric vehicle goal by 2030 will require 10 times more rare earth metals than we have today. Over 90% of the world's supply currently comes from China, by the way. Electric vehicles require a lot more rare earth metals than conventional cars and produce a lot of waste in the process. They provide future benefits in terms of reduced pollution by emitting today. Similarly, rockets pollute to get to space for now, but they're establishing the infrastructure that can bring value and reduced emissions to Earth in the future. A side point to illustrate here is that we're establishing a water-based economy. So we'll see a transition to water-based propellants, which means the pollution of these rockets will be drastically reduced. I do get a kick out of telling people that the New Shepard water exhaust, rocket exhaust is water. Again, from what I've seen, that doesn't seem to be public knowledge. So this chart on the right here shows the value of minerals present on asteroids at current commodity prices. The value of the asteroids increase in a clockwise manner starting from 3 o'clock, and the distance from Earth increases radially out to 2.5 astronomical units. So I put Earth's total global economy value on there, and you can see that most of the asteroids on this chart are more valuable than Earth's economy itself. One of these asteroids, 16 Psyche in particular, has enough minerals on it to last us 1 million years at current mining rates. The amount of saved emissions from that is truly unfathomable to me. So back there to there being a variety of ways to convince people. The spending conversations may be easier. These pollution conversations are tougher because there actually is a pollution cost incurred today. So the PR efforts might look different. The effort here is for the greater good, the long term, which we can illustrate with numbers, but we have to start receiving tactical results for our PR teams, as it will take time to fully relay that message. Again, this point's a big one, but it's a difficult one to make. If the concern of the individual is the pollution that this is causing today and the effect on them today, you have to connect with them on an emotional level and relay that one of the primary goals is to enable mining off-world so we don't have to mine and pollute here on Earth. For example, when talking to, say, parents who are unswayed by facts, ask them to consider what it would be like to live in a world next to zero pollution for their kids or grandkids. So some of you may be wondering at this point, do these PR efforts actually work? Well, NASA conducted a survey a few years back to gauge the general public's opinions of NASA. And they found that pretty much everyone knew who NASA was. They just appreciated them and supported them. They didn't really know what NASA did. They were kind of stuck in the Apollo era, and they didn't think NASA was relevant today. There was about a 50-50 split in response on the relevancy question. Then NASA showed them some of those spin-off technologies that I mentioned earlier and surveyed them again and yielded exceptional results. There was over a 40% increase in the positive response category and an 18% decrease in the not at all. So these methods were very effective. So if we want to convince a variety of people, we have to take a variety of tactics that I've outlined here. We have to educate the public. We have to have public and media and regulator outreach. We have to establish ambassador programs in our companies. And when it comes to pen to paper in terms of policy making, I think we should adapt the approach outlined for the Hague Space Resources Group that suggests an agile and incremental approach based on technological progress. That is, if the technology to exploit a resource does not exist, neither should the policy. In addition, separate legal regimes should exist for separate mining activities in space, such as mining on the moon versus mining on asteroids. Technology often paces policy, so granted, this is a difficult line to walk, but it can help prevent ambiguous or restrictive policies that we face today, such as the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. So here are the links to those resources I mentioned earlier. One example I like to give here at Lunar Outpost is our highly successful air quality monitoring units, the Canaries, of which we've sold over 2,000 across North America and the United Kingdom. This technology was actually a spin-off technology developed for a Lunar Gateway project to monitor the air quality. Thank you for your time. I hope this continues to stimulate conversations around the narrative surrounding the industry and what we can do about them. A few final points I'd like to address based on the numerous conversations I've had after giving this presentation. Again, the point here was not to sell you on the oil and gas industry. You can take or leave it in terms of the info I presented. The takeaway I want you to get from that is summarized in that Abraham Lincoln quote I showed at the beginning. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And again, the practices and data I mentioned was specific to California, so I'm not speaking on the industry as a whole. Next, I don't have all the answers as to what we should do and how we should do it. That's why I'm suggesting we get PR teams involved. So one suggestion I do have for the individual, however, is to take a look at your research or your technology or company. And rather than just explain how it fits within the ISRU or space resources or even just space value chain, take a step back and show how it fits in the global value chain. By that, I mean, show how that research and technology is going to benefit Earth, humanity, or that individual you may be talking to. It can either be a direct benefit, or often it's in the form of externalities, either a positive, as in the spin-off technologies, or the removal of a negative externality, such as mining pollution caused on Earth. By mining on off-world, we remove that negative externality. So thank you again for the opportunity to get to present this and the positive response I've seen. So please reach out if you'd like to continue the conversation with me, or if you have ideas to help with this presentation or issue. And finally, here are some of the references I used throughout this presentation.